Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it, Efka?
I hear that time flies like a banana.
Does it fly like approximately a 2-month-long banana flight between us recording Let's Plays episodes?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so this is Last Place episode number 16, I believe, and sorry for the hiatus. It apparently takes a lot of time for us to make our regular videos and stuff, and we've both been trying to get this recorded for 3 weeks now?
Yeah, there's always something that gets in the way, and it's such a busy time for us right now, especially with our Kickstarter coming up next month, and of course, you have a thing going on right now, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, as of about 3 weeks ago, well, this whole month of February, I've been doing it's called, in quotes, John Goes Pro pledge drive, because I'm now professionally making videos on my YouTube channel, John Gets Games. And that means I am dedicating every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday to making videos, but it also means I'm making a lot less money at my old job. So yeah, it's been just been pushing the Patreon campaign. Honestly, maybe a little more than I feel super comfortable with, talking about it all the time, but it's gone really well. There's been a lot of extra support, and so that's definitely great to see, considering I'm trying to do this more professionally. I mean, you've been doing this professionally for a year, I guess, because you did your first Kickstarter last year.
Yeah, so I mean, technically, I am doing this professionally because this is my main job. I don't really do another job right now. Well, it's technically not true. There's a little thing on the side that I do for an amount of income that is not in any way supplemental to no pun included, and what we make. But the reality of it is, yes, whatever we made off of Kickstarter, we use that to basically fund me doing this full time, and then Elaine pitches in whenever she has free time available.
Yeah,
and we wanted to do that because we thought this is the only way that we can get it off the ground properly. And hopefully what's going to happen this year is that we are going to get it off the ground properly. So we'll see. You've been doing really well, though. I do have a question. Why is it John Goes Pro and not John Gets Pro?
I don't know. Honestly, the John Goes Pro thing was Jessica, my wife, and I were just talking one night, and it kind of came up. I don't even remember who said it, and it was let's go with that. Sure. I mean, the idea was, try and draw attention to the fact that I'm trying to do this more. But anyway,
no, don't brush me away. I have so many more questions.
Oh God.
So when John gets to being pro, because he goes first and then he gets there eventually, where will John go next
after being pro?
Yeah,
I suppose in the future, John will get retired. That's a long way off.
Wow, it's a long journey for you then.
Yeah, I guess I am going pro. I guess maybe at the end of this Patreon pledge drive, I will technically have gotten pro. I don't even know anymore. But yeah, if you're interested in checking this out, there's lots of stuff at patreon.com/JohnGetsGames, and that is going to wrap up my advertising spiel at you right now in this podcast. We, as normal, are going to be talking about 3 different games. We've decided on 2 of them, but Efka has decided to let me kind of wing it with the 3rd one. So it'll be interesting to see where we go with that.
I am very interested and excited. I have heard both the options, and I couldn't choose.
We might be overhyping it, but we are going to start with, which one do you want to start with, Efka?
I think we want to talk about the biggest and the dumbest. And by that, I don't mean in terms of game length or size, but in terms of its thematic scope. Let's talk about Palaces of Mad King Ludwig.
Palace of Mad King Ludwig.
Not one, sorry. I'm still stuck in the castles mode, whereas there's many castles. Here it's just one palace.
Yeah, this one came out, I guess it was technically released at Gen Con last year, but there was 8 copies total. But yeah, this one, it's the thematic sequel to Castles of Mad King Ludwig. But honestly, I think it's more of a mechanical sequel to Suburbia, because what's going on in this game, in Palace, is that you are all trying to make a single ridiculous looking palace, by putting down these square tiles into a central area, and this palace is going to be slowly encroached upon by a moat. And inside this palace, you have dungeons and throne rooms and every kind of room you could imagine in between. And the game ends once the moat completely enwraps the castle, and you have this ridiculous looking thing in the middle, and then you score points for about everything you can possibly imagine.
John, I think you're forgetting the most important element of the game: swans, and how many swans there are in
Oh,
just one
yeah.
box of board game. There are so many swans, and I'm very concerned because in England, I don't know if you know this, but swans are like sacred birds because every single swan, I'm not joking, is owned by the Queen.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm serious. Yeah, every single swan in England is the Queen's property, and if you but harm a
Wow.
swan, you will, like prison sentences and financial fines and all that kind of stuff. You can't eat swan here because you'll get in a lot of trouble. So just to have this box with like, I think there's probably like easily 100 swans in there. Isn't
Easily.
There? Yeah. I'm very concerned because if but one of them, goes astray, suddenly I'm responsible for the swan that I've had and I lost.
I'm pretty sure swans are mean. Like, what if a swan attacks you and you defend yourself?
I can answer that question. A swan has attacked me once. And
how long were you in prison for defending yourself from the swan?
Thankfully, this did not happen in England. This happened in Lithuania.
Oh, okay.
I was 8 years old, and where I lived in like not the town center, but just outside of town center, and it was kind of like this really funny area where a lot of people who have constructed the railroad worked. So there was like, okay, so our city needs a railroad. So in Soviet times, when Stalin or Brezhnev or whoever was in charge, they were like, okay, well, let's bring all these workers into this area, give them housing, and they can work on building the railroad, and they can also build their own like blocks of flats and live in there. And so they did, and then the railroad got built, and all the people that worked on that railroad, like, they were basically out of the job because, like, well, the work's done and we all live here now. So what do we do next? So it was a bit of a sort of a rundown area. We just kind of moved there because I think the property was cheap. And so you had these like blocks of flats and this like kindergarten, and then there was these really rundown garages, like there's blocks and blocks of garages. And if you go behind those garages, there was a pond. And I remember as kids, we used to go to that pond because, let's face it, it's the Soviet Union. There's not much else to do but to go to a pond, and there were birds there, like ducks and geese and swans, and so we used to like throw like sticks at those swans or whatever because we were horrible children and didn't have anything else to do really. And so the swan got really unhappy with me throwing not a big stick. Obviously, we weren't trying to hurt the swan, just get its attention because we needed attention from birds. And so it decided to kind of like come out of the pond, and it like had these massive wings. I mean, like it was the wingspan of an eagle or something like that. And it was coming right for me. So I decided to run, and then my foot got trapped into in this like ditch, and I almost broke my leg. And then that swan was still coming after me.
That sounds horrifying.
I'm not going to lie to you, quite a traumatic experience. But
just kind of dredging that one up from your childhood. Didn't see that coming this morning, did you?
No, I didn't. This was not a story I planned to tell, but since we were on the subject of swans, and you mentioned being attacked by a swan, I thought I would share.
Well, it appears you survived. My question is, was it like a blue swan or a red swan or maybe like a yellow swan or a black swan? There's so many different colors of swans in this game.
Yeah, I think it was, so we adopted a name for one of the types of swans in the game as phantom swan, which is not what the game calls it. It actually calls it secret swan, as if it's some sort of a spy.
Oh, we totally call it secret swan. Absolutely, like I'm getting a secret swan.
But I was actually disappointed by its secretiveness. So we just adopted like ghost swan or phantom swan because
that works too.
Yeah, like the
How about Ghost in the Swan?
Ghost in the Swan. That's very good. Yeah.
Anyway, this is the longest we've talked about a currency in a game ever.
Yeah.
So yeah, you spend swans to do stuff.
Yes.
there it is.
Yeah.
And the game, like I said, mechanically is more akin to Suburbia because you're unlike in Suburbia where you're making your own little suburb. Here, you're doing the same thing, and you're just making a big castle in the middle. But you are drawing tiles from little conveyor belts, and they get cheaper as they get down near the end. And as you put them down, you're going to be putting your own little tokens on it to be like, I own this tile. I put this tile down. Aren't I cool? And then you get like I said, points for doing so many different things, for doing putting down a wide variety of different tiles, for putting down just a lot of a single tile. Lots of tiles have their own scoring condition. And I remember when we finished our first game, our heads were swimming with the number of things that we're scoring. And honestly, I didn't even log the scores for our first play because we had missed the fact that you also get points for having different sets of multicolored swans at the end of the game.
Yes.
Like, there's so many different things you score points for. We just missed an entire significant portion of it. So it wasn't until my second play that I really felt like I played the game for real, because that's definitely a significant thing, because not only are the swans currency to buy tiles and do various things, you also need to hoard them because you get quite a bit of points for having the different sets.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually didn't feel like I properly enveloped Palaces of Mad King Ludwig until like about our third play. But I think there's a reason for that. But first, so you mentioned one big change from castles, which is the fact that you're not building like your each own individual castles. You're building one palace. You're just building one thing together. The other change is the system, how you acquire tiles, because the one thing that set castles apart, I think, from many games, is that there was one person every round. So, like, there's rooms, and you can buy these rooms, and you can put them into your own castle, right? But there was one person every round, and that role rotated, that was in charge of pricing those rooms. And they could say, well, this room costs that much, and this room costs that much. And you kind of have this cool mechanism of evaluating what people want and how much they want it, but you also don't want to set the thing that you want yourself too low, because you're going to be purchasing last. Because if you set it too low, then people are just going to buy it. But you also don't want to set it too high, because you want it to be still affordable for you when it comes back to you. So that was a really cool element of castles that is entirely missing from this game.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I like Palace of Mad King Ludwig so much more. Because personally, like, I did think that pricing mechanic in Castles of Mad King Ludwig was intriguing, but it was also, it just destroyed our downtime. Like, the analysis paralysis of trying to price out the tiles while everybody else was looking at their phones, because there's literally nothing else to do while one person's brain is spewing out their ears as they're trying to figure these things out, it killed any semblance of fun that I had for that game. And so I think that's part of the reason why I enjoyed Palace so much more, because it took the simplified suburbia conveyor belt of just spending a little bit of currency to get tiles, and they get cheaper as they go down, and then you add them to the board, and then you still have the fun of like, wow, this palace looks ridiculous. We've got a bottomless pit next to the throne room or something like that, without the downtime. But I know a lot of people didn't suffer the kind of downtime we did. I mean, it sounds like you probably didn't, if you have positive things to say about it.
No, absolutely not. And actually, ironically, I've also heard your critique of castles more than once as I was playing Palaces of Mad King Ludwig. People saying, oh, I'm glad that's gone. And I'm like, really? That was, for me, the exciting part of the game. And I think it all depends on who you're playing with and how seriously you're taking the game. For me, it never felt like a very competitive game. It didn't feel like a game that I really want to win this. I really want to, like, be into it. For me, the part of and joy of Castles of Mad King Ludwig was building my own castle and seeing what stupid thing I'm going to come up with. And that sort of interaction of pricing and going and just kind of, like, I guess you can try and work out, what's the exact right thing to do here. But part of it was actually the fun of seeing it, how it's going to play out. So I and people I've played it with approach it from the perspective of like, well, okay, let's just kind of wing it, set the price at something and just see what happens. It's kind of like almost, you put random input and then you get an output that is hopefully funny.
Sure. Oh, and if the people I played with played it that way, I think I would have enjoyed Castles of Mad King Ludwig a whole lot more. But I think it's interesting that when it comes to Palace of Mad King Ludwig, that even though, so in Palace, all the tiles are squares, and in Castles, the tiles are a variety of different shapes.
Yes.
And I found that when the game of Palace was over, I still enjoyed the wonky, goofy looking thing that we made, even though all the tiles are homogenous in this one. And that was another thing that kind of clunked in my brain with Castles, was like, I'm going to get this tile. Oh, wait, does it fit? No, it doesn't fit because it's this weird shape, and now I've screwed up and blah, blah, blah. Like, I think it sounds kind of lame. I feel lame for saying that I prefer Palace because it has this more like dumbed down, palatable mechanics. But I mean, that is kind of what ended up happening for me.
Yeah, I actually going in recording this, I thought you would probably like Palaces more. And honestly, I didn't. And it's not just that the game is less thematically appealing. It's definitely a more mechanically solid game. It's very clever, but I think it is probably too clever for its own sake. And actually, just dealing with this one palace, sorry, oh my god, when is that going to stop? Just dealing with this one palace felt completely unruly. Like, we had this thing in front of us that was just probably too big for any of our sakes as architects, and we don't know what's going on anymore. It's just gone completely out of control. And maybe that is thematic, but I felt overwhelmed by the continuous onslaught of options. And there's not only like 5 tiles each round that you can buy from, but also like there are so many places where you can put them, and depending on where you put them, like it's theoretically not that exciting, because all that happens is basically every tile is surrounded by 4 entrances, and they each have a color-coded swan on top of it. And if you can join it with another swan of the same color, you'll get one swan of that color.
If you join it with another tile of that color, yeah, you match the doorways. And
yeah, you match the color of the doorways, yes. But then if the previous room is owned by someone else, they will also get a swan of that color. So you're trying to kind of build for yourself, but also in a way where maybe hopefully you can leech off of other players' colors, because if you want to get a certain color, because you're collecting sets and colors are important. And then later you might get a room that says at the end of the game you score 3 points per every green swan, and suddenly green swans are really important to you. Mm-hmm. And then what starts to happen very, very quickly is it devolves into an incredibly aggressive game where so let's say someone picks up a tile that, if completed, meaning all the doorways on it are surrounded by doorways, basically, it's not blocked off. If you complete that tile, that's 7 points at the end of the game. Good luck completing that tile, because as soon as you pick it up, everyone will aggressively try to block it. And it's not the aggression so much that bothers me. It's just the amount of things you have to consider. Taking a tile and placing a tile, and none of the decisions felt like, oh yeah, I got this. This is a good placement. Sometimes you do that. Sometimes you place a tile, and I think that's the joy of tile placement games for me, where you place a tile and you go, oh my word, that is the perfect spot, and that's the perfect tile, and they fit together, and it's like the pieces of a puzzle coming together. And I very rarely got that feeling from Palaces, because I was just mostly overwhelmed.
Interesting. Well, I've only played it twice, and like I said, the first time I don't even really count, and I'm looking forward to playing this one more and feeling it out. I don't think I'm ever going to be screaming from the mountaintops about how amazing this game is, but I certainly enjoyed the second play, but I also won, so that, it's always fun winning, and you definitely, it is definitely a little overwhelming, the number of different things that score you points, and you have to consider all that stuff and all of the things that your opponents are getting points for and how you can block them, et cetera, et cetera. There's more going on than I expected. It's also pretty fiddly. There are like hundreds of tiny cardboard colored pieces, not just the swans, but also the player pieces on top of the tiles, and you have stacks, and you just have stuff everywhere. It's not a gross looking game, but it's a very busy looking table when you have it set up.
Did you enjoy punching out those little player, like?
I kind of did. It was like a little, I mean, just board after board of these tiny little, notes and keys and crowns and that kind of stuff.
I think I probably like disabled my thumb for like the next day or something like that after trying to punch that out. But you know what? So I've never actually won a game of Palaces, but the moment it all came together for me was the third game that I played, which was a 2-player game with Elaine, and she beat me by just like, I think 4 points, and the scores were like in the high 200s,
Mm-hmm.
And
that's close.
Yeah, it really is close, right? It was like 2 or 3 points apart or something like that. And actually, Elaine was certain she was going to lose, because I got so many extra points from collecting sets. Mm-hmm. Like I had 50 points more from sets than she did, and she was like, "There's no way I'm winning this." And then it kind of all came together at the end for her. And the reason so I mentioned that this game makes me feel like there's just information overload, and that's because I played a 3 and a 4-player game first, and the 4-player game just felt completely all over the place. Like, this person's doing that, that person's doing that, and I'm doing this, and what is everyone trying to do? I'm like, every time I place a tile and I have a plan, it feels like before it gets back to my turn again, like I have to rethink that plan entirely because everything's going to change, right?
Yeah.
And then in a 2-player game, it felt like, because it's just bouncing back and forth, like I could actually plan a lot better. I could sustain like a strategy. And also, it became super cutthroat to a point where, like, we were saying, do we want to do this to each other? Do we want to play this game where, like, we're being so aggressive to each other? And we decided yes, because that's clearly what the game is intended to be. You know, you're meant to block each other off all the time and, you know, try and kind of desperately outbuild each other. But that made the most sense. That was the game where I felt like this is close. This is a lot tighter than a 3 or 4-player game, and it felt like we had this kind of constant bouncing back and forth. So if you like 2-player games where you don't mind getting really aggressive with each other, I would probably recommend Palaces of Mad King Ludwig.
Cool. Well, I've only played it at 4 so far, so I'll be interested to see how it goes at lower player counts. At this point, I think we should start talking about another game that also has a previous game that we're going to talk a lot about. And that's going to be Gaia Project and then the aforementioned Terra Mystica. And I know that we've actually talked about Gaia Project before on the podcast, but that was like last September, I think. And you and I discussed our impressions of a demo that we did at Gen Con. Yeah. And at this point, we've now both played many games of the actual full game. And I know you actually just put out a really good review of it last week, right?
Yeah, we did. I'm really proud of that video, actually. If you've not seen it, you should go watch it. It's got a bit where I get married, and I think it's fun.
So I'm planning on reviewing it myself, probably in the next week or two. But we decided that it'd be interesting to talk about it here. In particular, talking about the differences between these two games. And so the really high level thing that's going on here with both Terra Mystica and Gaia Project is you play an asymmetric race, and you are going to be expanding out onto the board, and you're going to be building buildings that upgrade from like a very crappy little building into a better building, into a potentially better building. And as you sprawl out on the map, you're going to be taking spots away from each other. And the places that you go onto have to be terraformed to match the color of your race. And that usually costs resources. And in both of these games, you are just spending a few different types of resources to do all of these things. So it's very mathy, and you're trying to calculate how much you can do on this turn, how much you can do on that turn, as you are just building up an engine. And by the end of the game, you're hoping to have a slew of points. And when I've played Terra Mystica a few times now, and I've enjoyed it, but I was very excited to play Gaia Project because it seemed like it was going to be a new take on Terra Mystica, like streamlining some of the rough bits and also setting itself in space, which I found personally to be a little bit more interesting. And I know that after our demo at Gen Con, we were both very excited about it. And after playing it a bunch of times, I can say that I still really like this game, but some things happened in the Gaia Project that I didn't quite anticipate.
Well, this is very interesting because we obviously reviewed the game very positively, and we said, for us, it's definitely the better game out of the two. Do you no longer feel like that?
No, I definitely agree. I think it is still the better game, but here's my my thought on it. Gaia Project feels like it was designed for hardcore gamers. Like, it feels like it was designed for the people who are going to play this game 50 times, for the people who are going to go to like tournaments at conventions and that kind of thing. Like, it's definitely a little bit more heavier game than Terra Mystica was. And what I was hoping for was a game of equal weight and equal complexity, just with streamlined bits and whatnot. Because one big difference between these two games is that in Terra Mystica, you have these little tracks, and they're boring. At the end of the game, if your token is the highest on the track, then you get a bunch of points. And points are good, but they're not the most interesting thing in the world. Versus in Gaia Project, each one of those tracks will unlock new abilities for you based on the track, like how far you can go, or how cheap it is to terraform, or just gets you more resources at the end of every single turn. And I love this idea in Gaia Project, and I was kind of hoping that this would kind of get grafted onto Terra Mystica and you'd have that same experience. But what we have ended up seeing is it seems like when Gaia Project is played with people who are not super experienced with it, oftentimes somebody just seems to accidentally into a much better kind of combo, or specifically they compete less with the other people around the table. And it feels like every time we play this game, one of the races has felt like imbalanced, but it's kind of differed from game to game, except for the Terrans. They just seem to be consistently overpowered, at least for amateur people playing. And I am a little bit disappointed that it feels like all of the issues I have with this game can be fixed by playing this game like 100 times. And it seems like the game was designed for those people in mind. And I know that those people are going to be very happy to have this, and they're probably the ones who are going to be still loving it and shouting about it 5-10 years from now. But right now, it seems like you can make some really big mistakes in the early game, even just like what race you pick, and that'll put the entire gameplay experience out of whack.
Well, I have some bad news for you. So you said you played Terra Mystica a couple of times, right?
I think 3 or 4 total.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. It is, I mean, that's just my opinion, but I think that's pretty much what Terra Mystica built itself on as a brand, I guess. And fair play. I think it is entirely appropriate to call it a brand because it stands out from other games because of that. I think that the races in Terra Mystica felt also really wildly unbalanced. For example, the giants initially, in my opinion, were just the worst thing in the world. And I remember Maggibot, who's a prominent Twitter board game personality. She tweeted this picture once of like, 5-player game of Terra Mystica going on, and I went, is someone playing giants? And she was like, well, no, actually, giants are really good in a 5-player game because like it's a really tight board, so they thrive on that. I'm like, oh yeah. I didn't even clock that. And that's me after like having played Terra Mystica like a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not the sort of person that'll like go on the forums and like read up strats, right? But it has always been a game that was designed for people who like the really competitive side of gaming. And I guess, it's ironic to I think it's a little bit ironic, like the Alanis Morissette kind of ironic that we have this podcast called Last Place, and like it's the second time the only time we've talked about a game for a second time, aside from Gloomhaven, is the game that's like probably, deliberately designed to be the most competitive game out there in terms of board games.
Yeah, I guess, but it seems to me like in Gaia Project, the effect of this kind of really experienced players doing well is exacerbated for a couple other reasons. I mean, one big one is the fact that there is this new type of spot out on the board. They're called transdim worlds, and they're kind of purple. And the only way to colonize them is to bump yourself up on one of the specific tracks. And once you do that, you gain an ability, and that ability lets you colonize those planets. And there are lots of these out on the board. Like, I think about twice as many of this type of purple planet as there are each one of the other colors on the map. And what I have found is that in every game that I've played so far, only one person has gone after them because there is it takes resources to go up in technology. And even one tick of technology is a really important thing that you might want to prioritize other ways. And many of the races specifically lend themselves towards doing this action. And this action is called Gaia forming. That's where the name of the game comes from with Gaia Project. And realistically, I don't think I like this very much at all because from my perspective, what I've seen is one person goes after that and that person has won every single time. And you might be saying, well, obviously you guys are playing badly because somebody should be competing. And I totally agree.
Yeah, you're playing badly, John. It's your fault.
No, I totally agree. Like, I don't I don't wish that it wasn't in the game because I think it's a bad mechanic. I wish it wasn't in the game because I think it just once again pushes the game towards requiring you to be so good at this game in order to compete on these levels. And if everybody is kind of doing their own thing and not checking each other constantly, then it kind of goes out of whack. And I know that checking each other in board games is fun. Like it's good to be competitive in this way, but I personally wish that everybody could gain access to these transit planets from the very beginning of the game, and maybe that tech track would just make it more effective so that it seemed like the barrier to entry to jumping into that competition and stopping somebody from running away with them was a little bit more. Again, especially considering some of the races, their entire asymmetric ability is about doing that better than others. And like, if they don't do that, then they're not doing their ability at all, versus lots of other ones could take it or leave it with those planets. So it's like, almost at the beginning of the game, you have to find somebody who's going to fall on the sword and be like, okay, I'm going to go after those things and try to compete with that other player just to stop them, even though they do it so much better than me and they get so many more perks out of it.
So I am going to go on a very long and maybe, I don't know, maybe some people will find this interesting, but this is really like just nerding out in terms of what board game design is good and what board game design, just to prove that, John, you are actually correct in criticizing this element of the game. And I think the real problem, and actually I've been experiencing this same problem in a different game, the real problem is not the fact that people have to check each other, you know, in terms of what this person is going away with that strategy. We need to kind of like, you know, condense on that person and maybe not let them overtake us, you know. I think the real problem is that a game has just one path where that is viable. And in board gaming terms, that is called degenerate. It's a degenerate strategy, as in, you know, the more and more it progresses, the more it disables the other players and enables one player. And it's actually very common in card games. So, for example, people might be familiar with Magic the Gathering, but on the competitive side of Magic the Gathering, you have Standard, which is probably one of the most prominent formats, not necessarily maybe people's favorite format, but we're not getting into that. What we're getting into is that recently Magic the Gathering has had a lot of bannings in Standard, which normally doesn't happen. The last time bannings happened before this recent spat was, I think, 2012, when they printed this card like Jace the Mind Sculptor, which became like one of the most powerful cards in the game, most powerful Planeswalker card in the game. Anyway, the point being is that the reason they started banning things again, because they found that one strategy is a lot more prevalent than other strategies. So, for example, if there are two strategies where people can pick like this direction and that direction, you know, it feels like a competition. Whereas if you have just one strategy and it's a dominant strategy, yes, other players can do something to stop that strategy from happening, from, you know, coming together. But it's not fun. And it's not fun for the players who are trying to stop that player. And it's also not fun for the player that is being stopped. And that's because if they go into this one strategy and they don't get to execute it because the other players decided to band together and stop them from doing that, that's a really aggressive and kind of, I don't know, unrewarding, unfulfilling, and very personal kind of board game experience. I don't think it's necessarily good game design. And from the same, you know, from the different angle is, you know, the players who are trying to stop this strategy, they're not playing their own game, because each board game, you know, it's like, you know, it encapsulates an experience. You go from point A, I have nothing, to point B, and specifically Eurogames, I have a lot of points, right?
Yeah.
But obviously points is not the driving thing that, you know, we play for. We play for that experience, for that journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if your journey concentrates on, well, I'm gonna try and, you know, put spikes in this person's wheel, because if I don't do that, they're going to have the better journey than I am. That's kind of weird, I think, you know? Like, and sure, that makes sense in, like, competitively aggressive games, but Gaia isn't that. It's more like, you know, I'm building my own thing. And I don't know. I don't like singular strategies that are dominant. And there are other games that are examples of this. I really love The Gallerist. It's also another example of a game where if you focus a lot on acquiring brown meeples and nobody else does, you'll do really well.
Yeah.
And when I asked Vito Lacerda, what do you do about that? Well, his answer was like, well, isn't it obvious? You just have everyone else stop that player. And I'm like, that's not a good answer.
Yeah, so going off of what you're saying, I mean, in the last play that we did, when we were selecting our races, we actually had, as a group, we had vetoed the blue races. Like, because of the couple games we played already, it felt like they were so strong, and people had, in particular, the Terrans, who are, you guessed it, ridiculously good at doing this Gaia forming. They were so strong that we didn't even want to play with it. And we kind of hurt ourselves in that respect, because that meant we had a smaller race pool. And then, unfortunately, that meant that we had less, we had more opportunities for overlap with the different types of planets and how they're cheaper for one race and cheaper than for another. And so that definitely kind of hampered some of the other players, because the blue race is probably the one that should have been picked by the fourth player, but that didn't actually end up happening because we were all just like, we don't want to play against that. And, you can absolutely blame our groupthink for harming ourselves in that one particular instance. But, like you say, like it felt like a degenerate type of thing that we didn't necessarily want to have to compete against. So I guess I feel like I've been a bit scatterbrained in this segment about Gaia Project, and I am going to be doing a review for it hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and I'm going to really try to organize my thoughts a lot more to kind of make this make more sense.
No, I think this was a very interesting discussion. We do not normally get to do that sort of stuff. At least, me and Elaine don't get to kind of delve into strategy that deep in our videos. So it's sometimes just fun to sit down and talk about it to another viewer.
Yeah, for sure. So anyway, I'll have a more airtight, hopefully, argument about it. I mean, I still really like the game, and I prefer it over Terra Mystica.
That's important to be said, because it's I still love it, and the game has problems, and that's fine. But Terra Mystica had that exact same problem, and actually, I don't know if you ever played with the expansion or not, but it had a very interesting way of solving that problem for people who necessarily don't want to be super competitive, but have played it enough to kind of go, don't want that happening again. So you start with 20 victory points. In Gaia, you start with 10 victory points, right? In Terra Mystica, you started with 20. So what happened was basically there was a module where at the start of the game, you would draw a potential race out of, or species, as I like to call it, out of a blind bag, and then you would start a bidding war in victory points.
Yeah. And again, you have to be really good at the game. You have to know that game well to evaluate it, but that is an interesting way to try to deal with it.
Well, do you? I mean, I suppose if you want to feel really secure about your decisions, you might, but I think it's kind of maybe not the smartest thing to do, but kind of hilarious at the same time to go well, I've played it a couple of times. I think I can maybe, come up with that discrepancy of -10 or -20 victory points, because the game asks you to do that anyway. Every time you play Terra Mystica or Gaia, oftentimes you are asked the question, how many points do you want to sacrifice for this amount of power? Right. And do you think by gaining that power, will you be able to make it up?
Right. Yeah. So I think it's possible I could talk about this for another 40 minutes, but we probably shouldn't do that.
Okay. I really want to, but there's a third game we have to talk about. So, John, what is the third game going to be?
Well, last weekend, I had the pleasure of playing for the first time ever the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Pizza Power game from 1987, and it was terrible. That's not the game I'm actually going to be talking about. I did actually play that, though. Yeah.
Okay, I can tell you straight up, on behalf of our listeners, right? Their voice is coming through my mouth right now, and it's telling you that we want to hear about Pizza Tower.
So my friend Owen picked this up for $3 at a thrift store, and we brought it to a board game kind of vacation we did, and we were all somewhat intoxicated already. We decided to bust this thing out, and it's a roll and move style game where you're wandering around this hideous looking board, and you're trying to draw good guy cards. And then different spaces also give you bad guy cards that have to go out in the different spots on the board. And
those bad guys.
And you need to defeat these bad guy cards. You need to defeat a certain number of them before you can go to the middle and fight Krang, which is the big bad guy. And so you're rolling and moving and walking around. And then when it comes to actually trying to beat the bad guys, you have a dice catapult seesaw thing. So when I say that, what does that bring forth in your mind?
Well, nothing, because all I'm thinking about right now is that you actually had felt the need to quantify that Krang is the bad guy. We know, John. Everyone knows.
I watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles a good bit when I was a kid, but my memory's terrible. Anyway, so what happens? Like, let's say you draw a good guy card and it has a 3 on it, and you're going to fight Shredder, who's a bad guy, and I think he has a 3 on it as well.
Oh, come
on. So now you have to take the die, it's a d6, and you put in this little catapult, and you put it at the end, and on this little catapult, there are 4 spots. There's one at the end, and there's a 3, 2, and a 1 spot. And you need to flick one end so the die launches into the air and lands in the 3 spots because you're fighting a bad guy of value 3.
Yeah.
And if you do this and you miss, well, you get one more shot. Actually, no, I think you have 2 out of 3 shots or something like that. I was somewhat intoxicated when we played it, and it was awfully hard. It was ridiculous, and it was only fun because we were not entirely sober. I think it ended up taking us like an hour and a half. And when you have to fight Krang, you have to, oh no, that's what it is. When you fight Krang, you have to land a 3 and then a 2 and then a 1, not necessarily in that order. Out of 4 shots, you have to make 3 of them perfectly in those different little spots. It's an atrocious game, but we laughed a ridiculous amount when we played it.
What's the availability of this game? Do you think it's going to be easy for our listeners to acquire a copy?
I have no idea. I mean, Board Game Geek has it listed. Let's see here. Wow, it's not very easy to acquire. You can get it for 25 euros if you're interested in going to Italy. But no, I would not suggest anybody seek this one out. It was terrible. I do want to talk about another game, though, for realsies.
Oh, wait, this wasn't like oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
Sorry, I thought this was the game.
This is not the game, because there's literally nothing else to say.
Oh, well, do you know what? Honestly, I would have been perfectly happy with that. This is our third game. That was legit for me. I had fun listening about it and thinking about Krang and Shredder, which I don't do often, but whenever I do,
it's been a little bit.
I have a good time.
Well, you know what? We've talked a good bit here. We can save the third one for the next episode. I think we should actually probably jump into some questions, right? Those exist, and we do want to answer those.
I know, right? Yeah. So I got a question all the way from Argentina. And I got a question from Rodrigo, who wants to talk about asymmetry in games. And I'm going to kind of abbreviate what the question says rather than reading out directly. But the general gist is that Rodrigo is not happy with the amount of asymmetric games that he is getting, because he's sometimes disappointed that when he opens up a game and discovers how you actually play it, he doesn't find the promised asymmetry that's there. And what Rodrigo wants specifically is a game that really lets him do something different to another player, rather than, let's say, my character has +3 to strength and there's another character that has +4 to strength. What Rodrigo really wants is games like Vast, where, you're basically playing a totally different game, or just the aforementioned Gaia or Terra Mystica, where, the powers that you get really differentiate. And I imagine that the question is, why aren't there more games like that?
Yeah, I mean, I love asymmetry in games, and I can kind of understand where he's coming from. But I think the really easy answer to that question is that it's really not easy to make those kind of games. Like there are lots of games out there where, I sell silk at +1 money, so now I'm going to try to sell silk a little bit more than you do. But I mean, there's a reason there's only one Vast, because that game has an entirely different rule set for each character in the game, and that's obviously the extreme example of it. We talked a little bit about Sidereal Confluence last podcast, I believe, and in that one, the rules are the same in general, but then each race does have some pretty significant different things that they play out. And I think the reason why you can come up with only a few examples of this is, like I said, it's a very difficult thing to design for, and it's essentially impossible to balance, right?
Yeah, because we just had this huge discussion about how Gaia feels, imbalanced in certain regards, and the amount that it takes to mitigate that balance is just crazy, and you're going to get yourself a headache. And actually, to be honest, I would recommend for Rodrigo, if he hasn't tried Kemet yet, to try Kemet, because that is a game that is not at all asymmetric, and I find it as the best example of a game that still manages to achieve that sense of asymmetry, but one that progresses from we all start the same and then develops into we all have completely different strategies.
Yeah, it's very emergent in that game.
Yeah, I think sometimes that asymmetry, as appealing as it is actually not all it's cracked up to be, because it leaves people going, well, I just played that game from start to finish knowing from the very get-go that I'll probably lose because I'm not as good at this particular situation as other people, And that can feel exciting up to a point, but then it starts to wear down. Whereas games like Kemet, where, you kind of start exactly the same, but by the end of it, my God, you are not going to be the same.
Yeah.
It can be just as engaging.
Yeah, we obviously, by we, I mean Efka and myself, we obviously really like this in games, but yeah, and we hope to see more of it coming out, but we totally understand why it's a rare thing, especially for the kind of extreme asymmetries that you appear to be looking for.
Yeah, and actually, while I still remember that, Sidereal Confluence, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's a great example of a game where asymmetry can work, just because so much of that game relies on negotiation and your personal ability to haggle and make a deal. So, the balance comes not because they're mathematically balanced, but because, well, a lot of it relies not on the rules, but on you as a person, right?
Yeah. Yep. All right. The next question is coming to us from Paolo Fenu. Sorry it took us so long to get to your email. You sent it on November 27th. Oh, we're terrible people.
Wow.
But the title of this email says, "Are you obsessed with board game maps? I am." And Paolo wrote,
obsessed with board game maps. It's so me.
And he wrote us a very long, wonderful email about it and kind of his journey of figuring out why he liked certain games and didn't like other games. And it seems like for him, he likes a game that has a map on it, not necessarily dudes on a map or area control, but just, even a situation like Marco Polo or Great Western Trail, he points out, are just big Euro games with a big map in the middle of the table that you're interacting with. And specifically, he said he sent this email in because in episode 14, we talked about Transatlantic, which is kind of like a new version of Concordia without a map. And we also talked about Altiplano, which is like a new version of Orleans without a map. And he mentioned that he's less interested in those new games because he likes maps. And I think from my perspective, I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with board game maps, specifically because I don't really like dudes on a map style games and area control is not a big thing for me. But I do like it when a board game like a Euro, you sit in the middle of the table. I do like it when it has a big old map on it.
I am obsessed with maps. Do you remember when we went to Spiel last year, and then on the very first day, I had this routine of in the first hour, I'm going to run around and do all the game pickups I need to do so I can just not worry about that.
Yeah.
And I remember I was running around with I probably good 20 games or something like that. And the one I was most excited about was the map expansion for Concordia.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a game. It was just a board. And I'm like, this is so cool. I can't wait to play it. And I've played it now, by the way. It is awesome. It's a cool new map. I liked it.
That pack was Crete and Egypt, right?
Yes.
Which one did you play?
I don't remember.
So I only ask because I played Concordia for the first time in a long time last weekend, and we got to play with the Salt expansion, which was nice. But
yes,
it kind of when I got home, I busted out the map that I also bought at Spiel, the Egypt and Crete one. And I read through the rules, and I was like, wow, that Egypt map does look really neat. And now I definitely feel like I'd like to get that one played because it's got a Nile flooding mechanism. And
yes, okay, that's not the one I played, but I'm so looking forward to playing that.
Yeah, that one, it looks like it adds a lot of different stuff. And yeah, so I think new maps into games that already have them is definitely an exciting thing to try and mix things up. And I think maps can just be very aesthetically pleasing. And so I understand why Paolo is obsessed with them. I wouldn't call myself obsessed, but I do like them a good bit.
Well, just to add a little bit of maybe, substance to this map meal rather than just us gushing over how, yes, maps are wonderful, what I really find very engaging about maps is from my time playing a lot of role-playing games, one of the cool things about creating a world, and this is specifically to do with world building, is the amount of grounding that a map brings to your game. Because suddenly, everything has to make logical sense. For example, why do you think settlements are 40 miles apart, generally? Or they used to be in the real world and also in a good fantasy setting.
Well, it's what you can walk in a day, right?
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Well, with horses, it's what you like basically
Travel in a day,
specifically traders who have a caravan. That's how long it takes for them to get between one settlement to another settlement.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's these sort of details that if a map is really well done, and it's a fantasy map, not a map of like our world, you know, then, you know, they'll come into consideration, and they bring game design to like a sort of level of realism that you wouldn't normally expect from a game, especially if a person who's designing the map has done their homework. And that's generally why I really tend to like games with maps more than the ones without them, because maps make sense. Unless they're maps like Comet, where it's just like wonky but symmetrical, which is also kind of fun, but a different kind of fun.
Yeah. All right, I think we're going to do one last question so this doesn't go too long. This one comes from Lee Stanford. He sent this in on November 28th, so apologies, Lee. And they said, now that you've both been to a lot of conventions, would you consider good and bad about them? And if you could only go to one, which would it be? Why don't you start that one off, Efka?
Well, if I could only go to one convention, I would probably not pick any of the big conventions, if I'm honest, because but this is so weird talking about it as a reviewer, because like a lot of people get excited about getting new games, and it's just not something that we worry about. It's not that we don't get we get excited about games,
right?
We just don't like the hassle of it, because for us it's part of our job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we want to be able to get like essentially work games for us or work materials, and we want to be able to get them at a convenient fashion so that we can dig into them, you know, with our excitement, and then produce something that's, you know, a relevant critique for the audience.
Yeah.
So for us, I don't want to speak for you, but for us, when I say us, I mean me and Elaine. Going to conventions is more about, you know, like chilling and unwinding and just being able to meet with people and play games with people. So I'd probably pick a small game convention, actually, you know, something that's not more than 1,000 people, or maybe around 1,000 people, where there's a lot of gaming going on, but not necessarily something that's entirely overwhelming.
Yeah, I totally see where you're coming from on that. I mean, I essentially have to answer this twice, like the one gaming convention thing. If you're asking me as John, the board game reviewer, it's pretty easy. It's Essen Spiel. Like, I just got so many games there. That's content that I need for the channel. But if I was Jonathan Cox, the guy who didn't have a YouTube channel until 4 years ago, Board Game Geek Con would be the hands down thing, because it's just 5 days of playing every game you could possibly want. And it had all the newest releases from Essen Spiel, which I obviously wasn't going to back at that point. So I think that illustrates that for me as a gamer, it is all about meeting people and playing games for as long as possible, just living in a little fantasy La La Land world outside of the regular world where you just hang out in ballrooms and play games for 18 hours a day and then just repeat that over and over again. And then also meeting new people, you know, hanging out with friends I make online, like, you know, you guys and whatnot. I think those all come into play. So I think, yeah, the short answer is the same as you. Like games, conventions where we actually play a lot is where the gamer would in me would definitely prefer to go. And as far as like the good and bad of conventions, I mean, I guess we've already mentioned a good chunk of that already. Like a lot of the good. I mean, I suppose when it comes to the bad part of conventions, I could say that it eats up a good amount of time and money. Like they're not cheap to go to at all. And so from a business perspective, I can make an argument that, you know, I need to fly to Germany to get all these games so that I'll have the stuff that people really want to hear about. But again, if it was just John Cox, the guy who likes board games, it doesn't actually make any content, I think I would still be probably only going to one convention a year, because they're just a hassle to get to a certain degree.
I think my kind of compromise answer is probably UK Games Expo, because it lets me have both.
Yeah.
Because of the way it's structured, you have like trading halls, which are like entirely separate from gaming halls. You actually have to leave the building and like walk for about, I don't know, 5 minutes to get to like the Hilton, which is where all the gaming happens, right? So you have these like two sort of biospheres where entirely different things happen. And both of those biospheres are actually pretty great what they're there for. It's not as big as Gen Con or as big as Spiel, but there's still a lot of games you can buy and some new releases and new stuff that's going to be released at Gen Con and Spiel that is being demoed at the time, you know? So you can experience that sort of zeitgeist thing and the, you know, mad rush for buying games thing, but also you can just leave all of that behind entirely and just go chill out and play some games. And seminars. There's also a lot of great seminars at Expo. It's probably like, actually, it's not probably, it is hands down the best convention for seminars because there's just so many amazing things happening.
Cool. Yeah, well, I hope that answers your question well enough, Lee. And I think we should probably wrap this thing up.
I agree. Let's wrap it in a... I ran out of wrapping paper, John. I don't know what to do. How do we end this now?
Okay, well, on that amazing note, it's been a pleasure having you around, and happy 2018, and we hope to do these a little bit more often than once every 2 to 3 months coming forward, but as always, we unfortunately can't make any promises, but we will see all of you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.